Welcome to our Leadership Lab. We're really excited to have you here with us today. My name is Chris Bacon. I am with the ARF. I lead our global research quality. I'm also affectionately known as the Dean of the Leadership Lab. And we're really excited to have you here today. Excuse me. So, today's class, we're going to talk about storytelling and influence. I just want to start one thing. I don't know how many folks had a chance or saw it on our when we posted this on our website, but we had a couple of quotes in the session description, and I just want to read these out for a second. Who knows where this is from? This quote is from. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times.
Tale of Two Cities.
Tale of Two Cities. Why is that so powerful? Why? It's the lead-in. It's an opening. So that opening line of a great story is so powerful. And what makes that opening line, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, so impactful is the use of contradiction. Immediately, Charles Dickens, he sets up tension in that best, worst phrase. And immediately you're hooked. You're like, okay, I've got to find out what he's going to talk about. Here's another one. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Who knows what that's from?
1984, isn't it?
1984, exactly. What's so powerful about that? Anyone? What's powerful about that phrase? It's the unexpected. Okay, he starts you off with, it's a bright, cold day in April. All right, I get that. And the clocks were striking 13. But wait a minute. Striking 13, clocks don't strike 13. What's going on here? He automatically, he sets you up with that opening line with something you're not expecting, and it pulls you in. Finally, call me Ishmael. Okay, this one. All right. Okay. Straightforward, but very powerful in its own way. I mean, Melville could have just said, my name is Ishmael, but instead he uses the phrase, call me Ishmael. Why is that powerful? Because what he's doing, he's inviting you in. As the narrator, by saying, call me Ishmael, he's inviting you in. So these are the different types of tools and techniques to great stories. And it's not limited to great literature. These kinds of great stories are also used in really powerful advertising. Who remembers, okay, I'll date myself here. Who remembers the ad 1984? Going back to that, yes. Why was that, what made that so powerful? If you think about it, if you remember that ad, you've got the face on the screen, you've got the peons in the audience, and you've got the runner. And it's the protagonist and the antagonist, it's that tension set up again. And you don't even know it's an ad for Apple, let alone for a computer, until the very end. But you're drawn into the story, and you want to see it and how it plays out. Great advertising, great stories bring us in. They bring our audience in, and they allow us to create a picture. They allow us to create a world that goes beyond what we do with charts, data, numbers. It allows us to transform our facts into something more powerful. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on great storytelling and how that can help you be more influential. So we've got 3 speakers today. And I'll introduce our first in just a minute, and then we'll take a break at around 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And then for the last hour of today's session, we're going to let you have the opportunity to apply what we teach today. So hopefully you brought a presentation you've either worked on or are working on now. We'll be here coaching and helping you to apply what we're teaching to what you're working on right now. So we'll finish up at around 12:15, 12:30, and we hope you take something away from it. But first I want to introduce our first speaker is Scott McDonald. So Scott is the new president and CEO of the ARF since March the 1st. We're very excited to have him join us. Look, Scott tells his own story better than anybody else, but I will just say a few words that Scott is renowned in the industry as, I won't say, well, 30-plus years experience in the advertising research business. He led the insights, particularly in the print industry. So Scott led the insights group at Condé Nast, at Time Warner. But I think just as intriguing, Scott began on the academic side and still continues to teach at Columbia. Scott has a PhD in sociology. So it just goes to show that great insights and great stories come from all walks of life.
That's right.
So with that, let me introduce Scott McDonald. Scott?
Thank you.
Thank you. That's my turn.
I would apologize for my voice a bit in advance. I succumbed to a cold yesterday, so we're getting through that. So when Chris asked me to teach this opening class, I don't know anything about storytelling. Why, so he said, "Oh, of course you do. Just tell some stories about your storytelling career." And I thought about it a bit and said, or actually what he said was, "You don't really have to do anything. Just show up and be pretty." So here I am. And I started actually with a bit of skepticism because I do have that academic tendency to question everything. And it's a bit of a vogue right now for storytelling. This is a well-attended class. There are people doing, they're interested in the topic they're participating remotely via video. Very, very good turnout. I think we had 250 people sign up for this class, which is maybe the largest number that we've had for any of the leadership labs. So it's obviously a hot topic. People talk about it, and it's for good reason because stories are important. They're memorable. They're the way that we can get an idea across. But I do have a problem with storytelling that will be revealed. I also have a problem with this clicker. There we go. So stories are important partly because they're ancient. They are part. They are really part of how human beings evolved and developed language to communicate with each other, and they did that through the exchange of stories. And so we have a lot of folk tales. We have Nordic folk tales. We have the Bible, which is contains many of the sort of classic stories. And in fact, if we thought about it a little bit, we could probably come up with a definitive list of the sort of archetypal story types. Okay, you've got the tragedy. Okay, the sort of heroic figure with a flaw. Icarus flying too close to the sun. Cain and Abel, rivalry. King Lear being too hooked on flattery and ruins his kingdom and his family because he is too demanding of constant flattery and attention. Remind you of anybody? There are narrative structures and there are stories that we know whether we realize that we know them or not. And I would argue actually that classic Apple 1984 commercial that Chris referred to is powerful partly because it's not unique. It taps a very ancient narrative structure that we all know about an oppressive system and peons being oppressed by it, and a single individual standing for freedom achieving victory over it. It's David and Goliath. You know, it's right out of the playbook of classic narratives. So whenever we are developing things like this for our own stories, whether we're aware of it or not, we often are tapping this big library that we've got. It's very ancient, that reflects some of the ways that we historically have told stories, even the comic tropes. So one of the reasons why TV commercials can be, I mean, comedy is the most frequent narrative structure that's used in television advertising. I think if you did a count of them, you'd probably get about 70, 80% of the commercials try to be funny, you know, and there aren't that many jokes. So they're kind of recycling a lot of the same ones, but with comedy, that works because you see it coming, you know, it's like slapstick comedy is funny because you see the joke coming a mile away. British, you know, something like Noise is Off is really funny because you can just see those jokes coming. The clowns doing Bill Irwin clowning stuff is really obvious. An 8-year-old can get it as well as a 70-year-old. It's really easy, and it is really funny. But it's tapping things that we already know because we've been exposed to them many times before. So we've got these narrative structures, and they're quite ancient. Stories also tend to have hooks. So there's just some piece to them that that grabs you. It's the part that you would be most likely to remember, or the thing that's often where the surprise is, or where the revelation is. And usually a joke will have a hook. So after Chris asked me to do this unit, I thought, someone must have thought about this more than an hour. So I went and checked, and indeed, my department at Columbia Business School offers a half course on digital storytelling. So I contacted the professor and asked for the required reading, and at least he had a whole set of references. So I thought, let's get academic journal. At least put a slide up that shows you, if you're really interested in understanding what people have been thinking more deeply about storytelling and narrative structures and kind of how those are deployed in history and in contemporary storytelling, you might want to consult any of those. How many people here attend theater in New York very often? Okay, good. So has anyone heard of the writer Annie Baker? Annie Baker. So she's sort of a hipster. She's really kind of wild. She's maybe 32, something like that. She's a playwright in residence right now at Playwrights Horizons over on West 42nd Street. She's written a couple of really, really interesting plays. She's one of my very favorite writers right now, including one that she usually writes plays that flummox people. They confound expectations. She did a play a couple years ago called Flick, that when you arrive in the audience, what you're seeing is the back of an old movie house. So imagine, you're seeing basically the back of all these chairs. So that's your view of the stage, and the characters are 3 sad sack types that work in this like dying single screen movie house somewhere in the suburbs of Massachusetts. And it's kind of a play about their interaction and about the decline of cinema and about fandom, because they're all, great fans of movies, and they play this elaborate game of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon sort of thing, where you name one actor and 2 different actors that you wouldn't really think of as being connected, and the one who can make the shortest trip in terms of number of movies that get you from Marilyn Monroe to Kevin Bacon kind of thing, wins the contest. So it's very geeky. She's a geeky writer. So her play that's up right now is called Antipodes, and it's entirely about the subject of this class. It's entirely about storytelling. It's a group of millennials mostly, maybe a few that are a little bit older than that, in a room, presumably in Hollywood, doing day after day after day of brainstorming to try and come up with a new story. And So if you get a chance to see it, I would recommend it. It is a really wry and interesting examination of the whole process of trying to dredge your creativity, but also running up against the reality of there being a limited number of stories, and of course it's also sort of poking fun at the creative community and all of the vanities associated with that. It's a very interesting little play. One of the things that's fun about it is that different people at different points make definitive pronouncements. There are only 7 types of stories in the world. And later on in the play, another character said, you know, there are exactly 31 story types in all of history. So of course, there's no consensus about what that number is, but everyone has a very definitive thing. Stories are also important because they're human. I think I already would have touched on this a bit. But really, the neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists and the people that study the way that we learn, the way that we acquire language, the way that we come to be fully human and use the faculties of human comprehension and communication, place stories at the very beginning of that process. It's the way that literally the brain learns to make connections, associate meaning. This is very tied up with the process of learning to read, of taking, decoding these symbols, being able to recognize them, connecting them to a lexicon that we store, that we learn. One of the people that study inequality in American society in this field, showed sort of devastating data about how unequal learning can be, really, getting up to age 3. So, under age 3, just as a mere function of the amount of storytelling that a parent will do with a child. And children that, get a lot of storytelling come out at the end of the process with bigger vocabularies, much better conceptual grasp of meaning and language. They start school in much better shape. And those separations can actually persist through a very, very long period of time. And it's embedded so early in the process that this is a field, this is a whole literature that you can find in cognitive psychology and neuroscience that just points to the centrality of storytelling as a fundamental way that we learn to communicate as human beings. Now, the part of this is intellectual, but part of it really is emotional, because part of what is important in storytelling is character. And we empathize with characters, we identify with characters. Historians who study the sort of history of violence, someone like Steven Pinker wrote a very interesting book a couple of years ago on this. He's a psychologist up at Harvard who does lots of very interesting work, but he wrote a controversial book on the history of violence. One of the important points that he made was that the sort of diminishment in kind of routine violence, and sort of torture and public floggings and things that were commonplace in the Middle Ages that became frowned upon. And eventually, the movement against slavery and other forms of human degradation are associated in history with the rise of the novel as a form. And the more that people, read A Tale of Two Cities and empathized with characters and suddenly could no longer distance themselves emotionally from people that were different from them, they came to be acquainted with them. So this process of storytelling activates, very importantly, empathy for other human beings is associated very much with that part. And I think sometimes when we have debates about negative consequences of media right now, where we might, be telling stories that deaden empathy or that conflict with that, then those become controversial. Although I'd say relatively few of them do. You go through all the Hollywood movies, and they still are kind of following a lot of the same basic storytelling steps. But it's an important part of our social education and the lens through which we perceive the world. And here's where it starts to get, I think, very moves closer into relevance to the kind of storytelling that we do in business and the kind of storytelling that we do with data, because this is where you begin framing an argument. This is the way in which you start interpreting information that might have different spins on it. And spin is a term about framing and storytelling from politics. But very often, if you're doing storytelling, even in business, and even if you're not relying on the classic frameworks, you usually are using at least some of the sort of classic elements of narrative writing, which is developing a character, a protagonist, providing some detail, some conflict that gets resolved, and then a path toward that resolution that we call a narrative arc. And those are typically there, very much human. Stories are powerful, and they're powerful because they shape the way that we perceive the world. So I mentioned the word framing before. That's a pretty important concept in political science and in sociology. That the way that we frame a problem helps to determine the way that the solution is perceived. So it's no accident. It's not an unfreighted area of language to say anti-abortion or pro-life. Okay, those are framing devices. They're talking about the exact same thing, but designed to stimulate different responses. That's kind of getting into the area of spin, but it's very much what we do in part with business storytelling, where we are trying to frame a situation in the way that we want our audience to understand it. So we're, and this, we'll get in a moment into part of how that's my problem with storytelling. Whoever controls the narrative controls, the perception. They tend to be kind of in the winning side of a given argument. If you've got the sort of master narrative, we're seeing a lot of this right now in Washington around the controversy over the Russian involvement in the election. Okay, there's a great struggle there to control the narrative between opposing political sides. But businesses and brands do this a lot as well. We'll talk about that. Part of the reason for that is that we don't remember data. We're very poor at remembering. I mean, we might pick up like the random statistic, but if you're doing a presentation at work and you throw a whole spreadsheet up on the, or an elaborate table with a lot of stuff, no one's gonna. I mean, even if they could read it, no one's really gonna be able to understand it. You might, the typical way of doing that is you might convert it into a graph that maybe they can understand. You might put a headline up that's giving sort of your interpretation of it. The headline is the closest thing to telling a story or a bit of narrative around it. But in general, if you want to actually get it into people's memories to where the thing that they remember when they leave the room, I mean, you have to make it really clear. You have to repeat it several times. You have to try and illustrate it with whatever data you have. But what you're doing in effect is if you're trying to activate memory, to have that be the thing that people take with it. That's what they remember. And very often I have the note up here about preaching to the choir. People understand that term? So we have a tendency, it's known in the trade as confirmation bias, where if we already think something, we will listen to the accounts that conform with what we already think and tend to ignore or not hear the things that conflict with what we think. Okay, so if we, like a candidate, so if I really like Donald Trump, I'm going to dismiss a lot of, negative news about him because I've got a confirmation bias in that direction. People do this, and this is part of the debate right now about social media and filter bubbles of people kind of being with only, talking to people that believe the same things that they believe and pushing everything else out, and then they're very vulnerable to disinformation and all kinds of other very misleading things where people are going around really with different facts in their hands or different perceptions. They've got different narratives, and there's not enough cross-cutting. I was very pleased to see the New York Times recently start a feature where they kind of try to pull in interesting or provocative articles from across the spectrum. We'll have sort of some conservative and some liberal, some things from The Nation, some things from, I don't think they've been doing anything from Breitbart, but from, maybe the National Review, and then some centrist things. But they encourage people to, not just read the New York Times op-ed page and think that that's the truth, or the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, or whatever else it would be. So there's an enormous amount of power involved in the story. And probably it's it's where you are not only doing a narration, but you're also doing an interpretation that leads to whatever your point of view is, your recommendation. It's at the heart of it. It's why we have a lot of people sign up for this class. You intuit, maybe it's just a gut course and figure you get a really good grade, but and there aren't any numbers in it, so maybe that's why people signed up for it. But it is extremely powerful. So the problem is that historically we've talked about novels, we've talked about the Bible, we've talked about Nordic folk tales, storylines for operas, things like that. So a lot of the most powerful writing is fictional, or it's things that are stories, and the very term itself involves a presumption of fiction. But when we're telling stories from data, when we're telling stories because our jobs involve trying to analyze some information or some research that is then the basis of making business decisions, investments, which may or may not be good ideas. They may, and this is a real risk when you say you work for the marketing department in a company, and the chief marketing officer really wants he's got an idea and he really wants that to go through, or she really wants that to go through, and you know it, and you're doing this work on it, and your boss really wants a certain outcome to the research. I can't tell you how many times I've been, approached by someone in a company and say, I need a piece of research to prove that X, Y, Z. Happens all the time. And so you're immediately set up in a bit of a conflict there, because you're being asked to write a fiction, and to, as I like to put it, torture the data until they confess. Which means you're going to ignore certain inconvenient statistics that don't fit the narrative. And that's where I think we run into an ethical problem with what we do. I think it's where we can easily contribute to the kind of cynicism about research and about what's a fact and what's not that has led to, this part of the state of things that we're in the country, in my view. So, stories as fiction and as entertainment, the kind of things that Annie Baker's characters are trying to come up with. That could be a commercial they're trying to come up with as well. I don't know. She doesn't make it clear. That's one thing. But when you move to journalism or to business, to marketing, it's a different balance. And I would argue that the most responsible way to behave in that, and if you start, confronting a situation where you've got data that don't conveniently fit the narrative, is to call those out. And they could be anomalies. They may be kind of something on the side, but I think the responsible thing to do is to make note of them and just simply say it doesn't perfectly fit the data. You might still be able to accommodate the boss's narrative, but at least acknowledge the fact that that there's some ambiguity around it. So that's a a judgment call. I have found when I would be asked to come out, remember at Condé Nast we had a big study for one of our beauty clients, one of the big beauty companies, and we did a bunch of research that involved evaluating ad campaigns. So this company had bought a whole bunch of ads for various kinds of beauty products. We did research where we did a data match to the subscriber databases and all the subscribers in Allure and Vogue and Glamour that had gotten 6 months of exposure to these ads for different products, and in some cases very, very expensive, like anti-aging serums that cost $80 a half ounce and stuff like that. So these are not frequently replenished, very high-end products. So this was a carefully designed study, and we could compare similar unexposed people from the database that had not been exposed to the ads to those that were exposed to the ads across a period of time, and I'm coming in to report on the list. And a third of the campaign showed no lift. I mean, 2/3 of them did. So it was a big fight with the sales department about how to handle what's the narrative there. And, I insisted on showing the null, on showing, that not all of them work, because in fact, not all of them did. So at the end of the day, the client was much more likely to believe their result because not everybody won. And that kind of conformed to their sense, but it was a fight with the sales department. This is where we get into the ethical questions of how whether you let the story take over and stomp out some of the facts, and I would argue that you do that, you're going to get beaten into doing it sometimes, but I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake for companies. I think it's a mistake for us as individual practitioners. We have our own sort of career. We have our own brand as professionals to take account of as well, and one does well to try and protect the reputation in that regard. But that said, if people don't remember data particularly well, what you're up against then in trying to apply storytelling arts to quantitative research kinds of sciences is basically putting the human being in it. You're basically trying to tell a story usually of the woman who buys the anti-aging serum, and come up with some motive and some action, some personification. So, that study as an example was one in which we were simply trying to, show the effect, whether the ad worked or not. But there were some variations in the creative, and there were ways in which the ad creative itself was conveying motive or what the characteristics, what the nature of the appeal was, and those provide really interesting ways of trying to sort of draw out the story. And I would wager that that was probably the most memorable part for the people who heard the presentations about the results of that study, because it was the part that was human rather than the part that was the number and the percent lift, which would have been forgotten within a couple of days, I suspect. I would say that in business practice, the most common form of storytelling that most everyone in this audience is likely to encounter is going to be around brands, because brands actually do have personalities. They have attributes that we can tell stories about, it's part of the long-term brand equity of individual brands. These things can be, it gets much more complicated now in an era of social media, because you can go ahead trying to tell a story about your brand, but consumers are empowered to tell stories about your brand as well in ways that were much more difficult before. So if you're United Airlines dragging someone off the plane and being, hammered in social media around all of that. You're not able to control your brand story very effectively like that. You've lost the narrative that you were trying to build up with your advertising. But I put a few examples here. Apple versus Microsoft, very classic ad, the kind of, the cool dude, the Apple guy, and the kind of chubby, nerdy, the Microsoft guy. So these are total stereotypes. They have no basis whatsoever in empirical fact. And I bet there was absolutely no research to try and sort of have a cool quotient. It's just pure advertising. It's storytelling. And actually in advertising creative, they're rarely burdened by any of the kind of limitations that I've just outlined that people involved in research feel as an obligation to try and stay true to the data. Someone like Virgin as a brand, so that's an airline, but it's also travel services and gyms, but they're all connected to the persona of a particular individual, who has a sensibility and a style that people affiliate with. And that's very different from the sort of, very official and crisp British Airways group. I noticed a gentleman over here having a bag that says Jeremy Deller from the Venice Biennale in 2013. So Jeremy Deller, and I've actually asked someone to see whether we can find that video that showed at the UK Pavilion at the Venice Biennale 4 years ago. It's brilliant. So Jeremy Deller is an artist who does work in a lot of different media, but this is done in video. And what it is really is about a 5-minute story about what is the UK. And it encompasses such imagery as a falcon, which brings back falconry and heraldry and all of the sort of tradition, but also the sort of wildness and freedom. So you go from that to a giant piece of construction equipment picking up a truck and crushing it. So you get all this sort of industrial power, and it's compacting it and putting it into a compactor heap. And this is all being done to music, David Bowie track, but it's being played on tin. I forget the name of the instrument, but yeah. If it's up, it's
I'll
up.
have to bring it up for sure.
Yeah, we could also do it at the end of my talk. That'd be fine. Yeah, but I just mentioned because countries have brands and brand stories as well, and this is I don't know whether Jeremy Deller thought in terms of in those terms, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did because there are so many elements of it that are endearing and are part of a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek. He celebrates the eccentricity for which the Brits are quite famous, and then he also works in David Bowie. So what's wrong with that? The others here are just interesting examples. I, of course, worked on those brand stories a bit, and then politicians, of course, have very important stories and narratives around them. So I thought it would be fun, just as a class exercise, to try this one. So this is the sort of thing you would do like at a focus group, where you ask people to personify a particular brand and then imagine what happens when they mix it up. And the point, rather than having everybody try and sort of do it, although it might be fun, was whether everybody has an idea of what would happen if the gap were taken over by a combination of Virgin, Aveda, and Zappos. So what would the gap be like?
Stores are going to have purple lighting in it.
Yeah.
but then there's also going to be a sort of earthy green as well from the Aveda. There's going to be sort of a wholesomeness with an energy, but it's going to be done very efficiently, and you can return anything thanks to that. That's right.
Actually, historically, the Gap is an interesting case of losing the brand narrative because, you know, the Gap also owns Old Navy and Banana Republic. Now, Banana Republic actually had a pretty well-formed story around it. It was kind of, you know, exotic. It was cargo pants and going on safari and, you know, surfboards and all this other sort of stuff. But they had, you know, they built this, through advertising, built a kind of outdoor, you know, it wasn't preppy like J. Crew. It was a kind of funky outdoor thing. And then, you know, they made it into an upscale Gap. And it started failing immediately at retail. It no longer really had any distinctiveness. It was just like the Gap that cost a bit more. You know, it's in my view an historical example of kind of misreading or not doing a good job of actually developing and sustaining that kind of story. So anyway, brand stories are one of the main things I think we typically get involved with. So from my experience, even though I do not present myself as an expert on storytelling at all, but I've still had some experience. I've already related, you know, the bit of advice about admitting the anomaly, letting the you know, embrace the anomaly. If you got a null result, put it in, cop to it. It'll make your overall narrative more credible. So I regard that as a pretty important trick of the trade. I think it's important to set yourself up, not just in terms of, you know, the horse walked into the bar kind of a setup for a standard joke, but, you know, very often you come to a meeting that you're going to give them your story now. You've done your work, you've analyzed your data, you have the narrative pretty well worked out, and you're coming in assuming that everyone knows why they're there, what the subject is, that they might remember the couple of changes to the project that were done in prior weeks, any of those kinds of things, and you'll make a very big mistake if you make that assumption, because they all have a lot of other things on their mind. They don't necessarily have the information on their calendar. They know that they have to be at a particular place at a particular time, but they don't necessarily know why they're there and what needs to happen out of that meeting, you know, what the purpose of it is, and what the expectation is for where it goes. So it really is important to lay that out, set it up at the beginning of the meeting, just to save yourself a whole lot of grief. Do not assume anything. Set it up properly, and including why they're there and what they should be able to leave with. Hard-earned experience here. Who's heard of the inverted pyramid? One journalism student in the class. So the inverted pyramid is a convention in journalism that stems really from the invention of the telegraph in the 1840s. So when, you know, the telegraph got invented, and you had this system of transmitting news across the North American continent over these newly strung wires using Morse code, it led very quickly to the first syndicated news services in the country. The Associated Press was created then. Okay, so all these newspapers in St. Louis and San Francisco and Chicago and Dallas and Miami and every place else would sign up for this same affiliated network of news briefs, and something would happen. President Lincoln was shot, you know, and it would go out to San Francisco right away. It just wouldn't go by horse the way that it had a decade or two before. But, you know, in each case, in each market, they might only have so many column inches available to run, you know, because they're different newspapers, different advertising, different space available for the news. So the writing convention in journalism, starting really from then, was you open with your lead. The most important thing in the story is your first sentence, your second sentence, your third sentence. You don't bury the lead, as they would say, or this elaborate prelude, and you're going to put it way down at the bottom. You know, so that is, it's important to at least have that version of it. It may not be the best for each situation, because sometimes you actually want to build suspense and you want narrative arc. You want to kind of, you know, set up something and make them wait for the big payoff. But you have to be really deliberate about which strategy you're using and which is most appropriate for the situation. If you only have a very narrow window for your presentation, then you're going to need to do it more like a journalist would, or in its more extreme pitch or version, the elevator pitch, you know, which is hypothetically the length of an elevator ride from the ground floor to whatever floor you're going to explain that movie idea that you have to the producer that you're trying to sell it to. So you don't have time, you know, but you have to, you know, in these scenarios, if your situation is, you know, it's going to be very, very compressed time, you need to be ready for that, which means you need to know your stuff really cold. It's not like you're still thinking about what the data say, you know. A variation of this also is that invariably the person who wants to be the smart person in the class says, well, what surprised you in this study? Thinking that's a really original question. It comes up every single time. So you know it's going to come. So have it ready, you know, as an elevator pitch kind of a thing. It's just, you know, it's being prepared. In some cases, the story is enhanced a bit by making the audience, making the audience convincing them that they don't know what you're going to tell them. It very often is the case in research, at least, that everything looks obvious once you already know it. It wasn't obvious before, you know, but, you know. So my favorite strategy for this would be to actually ask people a quiz question before you start the presentation. You know, so if this were, say, about linear television, okay? So show of hands in the room here. How many people think that the American population right now, that half of their television time is spent watching linear TV and half is watching on-demand TV, you know, maybe search their phones or Netflix or, you know, other things. So linear TV is old-fashioned. You turn on the TV and watch it live. So how many people think that it's more or less than 50% viewing? Less than 50% viewing right now in the American population. And how many people think it's more than 50%? Okay, so the majority thinks that linear TV is still the majority. How many people think it's more than 70%? That's fewer. So you get my idea. If we were probably doing this in another setting, I would actually say write it down, hold up your number. You know, what percent of so the number is actually 76%. 76% of the time, the American population. So, you know, there's a lot of attention to these other television formats. But I use it as an example just simply because if I just say 76% is linear, maybe you're going to think, oh, we already knew that. But in your very sophisticated audience, you might have, you know, a number of people who would say, well, isn't it like, you know, 90% nonlinear now? A lot of people would take that from reading the press. So surprise people by withholding some information and quizzing them up ahead of time. Sometimes it's the opposite of the inverted pyramid where you're doling it out and kind of making the bag. Vary your graphics. So, you know, do not show people table after table after table, bar chart after bar chart after bar chart. It is, I mean, by the second or third time, they will be asleep. You know, it is such a story killer. So there are a lot of different ways to display data. Use them, as many of them as you can, and it's also okay to not use PowerPoint sometimes. We make fun of the straw man, you know, sometimes, but it's a useful device. You have somebody, you know, the kind of like useful idiot to set up to defeat in telling a story, and you can you know, certainly use that. So those are at least a few of the ones that I've used. I suspect that others will come up with more amusing ones to share. And then, you know, the most important is, again, the one that I mentioned at the beginning. You know, don't let the story get the better of the facts. So I've listed at least a few classic stories here where, you know, the monster gets out of the lab, the story takes over. You have like a Frankenstein monster, the sorcerer's apprentice. These are all variations on an ancient narrative of, you know, runaway, something that we create that then runs away and gets the best of us. Don't do that with your data. You'll regret it in the long term, I think. So let the data drive the narrative. That's what Scott says. Thank you. That's all I have for you. And yes.
Well, it's really something, and that's in the context of the Venice Biennale. I mean, can you explain how it was shown and what?
Well, it was part of the, you know, at the Venice Biennale, different countries have different spaces in this garden, different little pavilions, and so it was shown in part of that. You know, what, like 7 minutes or something like that. So, yeah, so it was just, you know, screened. It was a little better viewing conditions.
Oh, yeah, right.
But actually not in some ways, because you had a lot of people jostling. You could actually pay more attention to it. But yeah, it didn't occur to me until I saw the reminder of the fellow's bag over there. So it's a good example of long-form storytelling without any express narrative. But I mean, you come away with all sorts of. I think what it does is also cues a lot of things that you already kind of thought about England. You know, having, you know, the march at the end is particularly interesting to me, because all of these occupations kind of getting all dressed up and going for a march is.
I think it's purely British to have tanks and tax accountants in the same room. That's how we collect the tax. Now we're going to get a little bit more into the detail of how you create stories. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about two things. I'm going to talk about, as Scott referenced, framing stories. I'm going to talk about how do you understand your audience and assessing the situation. And I'll give you some examples of some of my own wins and failures in storytelling, and hopefully that will remind us that it's not always perfect. From there, I'm going to turn over to Helen Doherty and Tobias Stewart from Graphic Digital Agency, a Kantar company, and they're going to take us through some really great examples and tools that we can use. And then we're going to go take a break, and then we're going to apply it. So let me talk a little bit about, excuse me, crafting the story. And I think the first thing, again, we've talked about it, but it is defining the story. So I want to give you an example, because visuals, there are so many different stories that we can tell. I mean, I think as Scott emphasized, we have a responsibility to be truthful to the data. But as we've all learned, people are able to make data say many different things. So, let me give you an example. What is a story? What's the story in this photo? And I thank my friends at the distillery for sharing this. Who wants to offer a story? What's going on here in this visual? Cinderella. Okay. What are the clues what are the signals there that give you that help you create that story?
Pumpkin carriage.
Pumpkin carriage. The birds overturned. Clearly, this is not passive. You've got people who want to investigate. So you've got the journalists who are right there. Here's another story I'll posit. It's actually not Cinderella. It's her stepmother. It's a story. It's a twist. It's actually not Cinderella, but it's her stepmother. And her stepmother wanted the prince for herself and didn't want Cinderella to have him. So what she did was she did a little shape-shifting, and she took on the form of Cinderella and locked Cinderella up in the closet and took off in the carriage. But Cinderella was able to escape, and as she escaped, she ran out onto the road to try to catch up with the carriage, so frightened the horses and the driver, they overturned, and now her stepmother is dead. And Cinderella's fairy godmother is now going to step in and whisk Cinderella off to the castle, where she will get her prince, or princess, whichever story you prefer. We can take one visual and tell lots of different stories. We can tell lots of different stories from any individual data. I think the thing is this: you have to be truthful to what you see and what you observe. Because while there's some who might posit there are alternative facts in the world, what we do as insight research advertisers, media folks, we do have a responsibility to data and to tell a story as it exists. Now here's one. Who knows this story, or who can tell a story in this photo? Need someone to tell a story, Tina?
He wanted to take a risk, or he wanted freedom. So he felt freedom in walking his across the World Trade Center.
Yeah. So for folks who don't know, this gentleman is Philippe Petit, and I think it was early 70s. Colleges. It was right as the Twin Towers were open. Petit was fascinated. So he's a tightrope walker, and he was fascinated by the Twin Towers. And put it in context, there had been great controversy around building the World Trade Center. Whole neighborhoods were gutted in order to build these two massive structures that, frankly, took years to become financially viable. And New Yorkers were highly skeptical. But Petit saw something different in the Twin Towers. He saw a thing of beauty. And so what he did, he surreptitiously, he strung a wire between the two towers, and as sun rose on a summer morning, he got himself up to one tower, and with his balance bar, he walked that tightrope from tower to tower for well over an hour. And there's great stories. If you can, I think it's the Ken Burns series on New York has a piece dedicated to the Twin Towers and a good bit on Petit. So this is what happens He's arrested for trespassing. He's 105 stories in the sky, and he's arrested for trespassing. Look at the view, look at the face of the arresting officer. What do you think he's thinking about? What's his story? Okay, so again, there's so many different stories that we can tell. And it's understanding what is that story, how does it grab you? How does it translate to the business world? You know, in the story and the narrative and literature, you talk about rooting for the underdog. The business version is the new market leader. You're overcoming challenges. Well, the campaign's stuck. You're conquering adversity. Well, half my team gotten laid off. That's, you know, all of these situations will translate into a business situation in one way or another. And I know folks are videoing, and I know you're taking photographs, and I want to reassure folks that the today's presentations will be available to everybody after class, so you'll be getting links to it within about a week. So don't fret if you see something and you didn't get it right then and there, you're going to get it after the class. I think the point is this. This is the reason why we want to talk and teach about stories is that it does relate to what we do every day. So how does one define the story? You got to just keep calm in this. That's the situation, folks. That is where it starts. Don't panic. You know your data. You know you can make that data sing, and without torturing it, and singing a song like we were talking earlier, like a dreary ballad that won Portugal the Eurovision contest over the weekend. Any Eurovision fans in the audience? Everybody know what Eurovision is? All right. It sounds like this year's competition was not as engaging as the bearded, Cheetah Verse, yes, from a few years back. But the point is this, before you define the story, just assess the situation. How do you do that? 5 questions I recommend you ask yourself to assess the situation. These are probably not new, but they're useful tips. Where are you now? Where have you been? Where do you need to go? And that relates to what decision needs to be made. And as you answer those questions, that leads you to what insight is needed to influence the organization to get to that decision. So let's break it down. Where are you now? Speak clear. Is the business up? Is it down? What are your consumers doing? What are the competitors doing? What are regulators doing? What's going on in the world? Take stock of where you are. Always a good starting point, okay? Because you can't get to the end unless you have a beginning. This is your beginning. Where have you been? So put it in context. Here's where I am now. Where did I come from? Okay, the fact that was the business on a high? Were we peaking or were we in a valley? I might have a 10 market share today, but I might have had a 2 market share a year ago. So that 10 is fantastic. But if a year ago I had a 20 market share and now I've got a 10, I am in deep doo-doo. Okay? Know your context. Was there a disruption in the marketplace? Did something fundamentally change my situation, my competitive environment? I think some of the best examples we have recently are the technologies. You know, whether it's the Airbnbs upending the traditional hotel industry, or the Ubers and the Lyfts upending, travel and taxi services. Those are the kind of regular, disruptions that are hard to anticipate, but it's important to understand where you've been. And then think about how has the consumer landscape changed. Okay? I go back to the Twin Towers and I go back to 9/11. Horrific situation. No one anticipated. But beyond the tragedy that took place on the day, there was an ongoing change in the consumer landscape and how it particularly made Americans and younger Americans who were growing up in that environment feel. And there are well-documented stories about how that incident influenced not just what happened in that immediate time around it, but how it will have impact over generations. Same was true for the Great Depression in the 1930s and the Great Recession in the 2008 to 2012. All of those things change the consumer landscape. Understand that, put that in context. So where do you need to go? You've got all this data in front of you. Okay, you can tell a story. Well, where do you need to go? Okay, if we're here right now in New York, or wherever you may be if you're live streaming us, do I need to go to Hoboken, or do I need to go to Greenwich? Because if so, I need to go in totally different directions. I need to know, but I still have a lot of data because I have train schedules. I just need to know which train schedule I need in order to get me where I need to be. So are you focused on attracting new business, new members, new consumers? Excuse me. Are you focused on keeping the ones you have? How many folks have heard of the term leaky bucket? It's related to business. What's the classic leaky bucket definition?
Filling the bucket up with new business, asking for new business.
Leaky bucket is just that. It's the metaphor for how your business performs. You bring new consumers into the top of the bucket, and you hopefully fill it up, but the problem is you got leaks. And you got to make sure that those leaks don't leak consumers out faster than you're able to replace them at the top. That's what you got to understand. Where do you need to go? Are you dealing with a leaky bucket? Are you having trouble keeping people in or getting people on the top of the bucket? Are you trying to look at new lines of business, new product categories, new media options? Are you defending against a competitive threat? What is it you need to do? Be clear about it. And that leads you to what decision needs to be made. Am I investing in a new marketing campaign? Am I actually turning the lights back on advertising that have been off for years? Wow, how has the world changed since I was last on air? And is it on air anymore if I'm only talking about a digital campaign and no longer talking about TV in its traditional form? Are you entering a new market? Excuse me. A new market could be new geography, or it could simply be I'm introducing my product into a new retail channel. What decision needs to be made is going to be your endpoint. And that leads you to understand what insights is needed to influence the organization to follow you along your story path. Again, look, I've been in the business for 30 years myself. I started at General Mills. I've worked at Pillsbury. I've worked at Citibank. I've worked at Colgate-Palmolive for many years. And I was the head of insights at the Gallo Winery for 9 years before joining the ARF 2 years ago. One thing I learned from the very outset, and I still believe to my core, like Scott, data needs to be actionable. The data needs to be pertinent. It needs to be relevant. It needs to be understandable. It needs to be digestible. But it has to be truthful. It has to be truthful. It has to be objective. One of the hardest jobs we have in our profession, you've probably all heard this before, the hardest thing you can do is tell truth to power. I can tell you the times when I sat in the CEO's conference room And I remember one time, this was a few years back. Joe Gallo, CEO of the Gallo winery, wonderful man, loved him dearly, I should say. But we were testing some new business concepts. And I was in his office, and I was presenting him the results. And we were doing a basic concept test basis, trying to understand volume potential. And I looked at him, and I said, well, Joe, this is what we've learned. This is how it stands up to benchmarks. These are how many people are interested in buying it. And this is how big I think it's going to be based on, a proposed marketing plan and so forth. And I said, look, I think it's going to be a mid-range opportunity. I don't know that I think it's something, really worthwhile spending the money to go buy. And he just looked at me, he threw his head out and said, that's up. Meeting's over. I've had it. He walked out of the room. Okay. You just had to see your CEO has just walked out of the conference room. He's, thrown his head down, he's disgust. And I turned to my boss and I said, I haven't had that happen to me before with Joe. And I said, okay, what just happened here? And he said, you got to understand your audience. Joe really wants to buy this brand. You're asked, he's talking about maybe $750, maybe $1 million to buy the brand. And he said to me, look, and keep in mind, Gallo is a family-owned, privately held company. Okay, it's not public stock or anything like that. All of the investment is funded by the family. My boss said, look, you're talking about $1 million. For Joe, that's like buying a new tie. That's nothing. You had to understand the context. And the fact that I was saying that, look, I didn't think $1 million was a reasonable investment for a brand that was only going to be so-so. Number one was not what he wanted to hear, okay? But number two, I failed to understand my audience. I failed to understand that the level of investment was not as important to him as how big the opportunity could be. And rather than saying, Joe, here's what we've learned, and here's how we can build upon it, I focused on the wrong thing. That's why he shut the door on me. Okay, you live and learn. But it was still objective, truthful, and made sure that the data was actionable, relevant, and pertinent. I had the insight, but I wasn't able to influence. Okay? So we're all going to go through that. But again, and we're going to give you a handout to use to walk yourself through for your own situation as you're revamping your presentations later on this morning. But think about it. It's really being able to assess the situation, and we'll pass out these worksheets in a bit. But then it's being able, once you've done that, is being able to tell the story and tell the story effectively. How many times have you been in a situation where you've got an audience like this? I know, we've all done it. We've all had it. Wouldn't you rather have that? Okay, maybe this wasn't at Eurovision, but I think we all response, right? Yeah. Okay. The question is understanding how do we know who's in our audience? You got to understand what's going to motivate them. So, know your audience and build a story, however you want to define it. Build it on how they think. You've got to understand. I needed to understand how Joe Gallo thinks in order to be more effective with the data and the story I had to tell him. Understand, is your audience more visual? Do they process information better through pictures? Or do they process information better through sound and words? Know that. And again, it's going to be hard. I mean, again, you've got to know whether you're talking to 5 people, 50 people, 500 people. And that's going to influence what you do. But keep these guidelines in mind. Thing 2, does your audience respond better when you talk about the forest, or do they do better when you talk about the individual trees? Or even better, do you get, I used to call them the folks who not even lost the trees, they are kissing the bark, okay? You're going to have bark kissers as well. And that's fine. You just understand where your audience is coming from. Are they more spontaneous? Joe was very much about making decisions on the spot, which was great sometimes when you wanted him to take action, but sometimes it wasn't always so great, because sometimes those spontaneous decisions could get us, they would sometimes get us into trouble. It's okay. We understood that, but if you understand how your audience responds, do they make spontaneous decisions? Do they like to take gambles? Or are they contemplative? Do they need to sit, simmer, stew? Do they need to digest that information? Know what it is, how your audience approaches things, and in order to understand what kind of a reaction you're going to get. The final thing is this. Are they risk takers or risk averse? Again, we're talking about a continuum here. Joe Gallo was a gambler. Not in the sense of he would go to Vegas. He was not that kind of a gambler, but he liked to take risks. He liked to take risks. And that was okay because, well, A, was the family business, so that was their choice. But he had the foresight, and he had the knowledge of the business and the industry to take smart risks. Okay? So, but understanding that he was, in certain situations, he was very much a risk taker. And in other situations, he was very risk averse. Very risk averse. If there was a situation, he was not as comfortable, he was more comfortable with the sales folks than he was with the viticulturalists, the people who would actually grow the plants and grow the vines. He actually knew it. He just didn't feel confident in his knowledge. And so, if you would talk to him about watering strategies, this was particularly true in my last few years there, as the drought was coming on in California. We had to rethink our watering strategies in the vineyards because there just wasn't that much water still to go around. Joe, you get him into these conversations, and he had to be very aware not to get too technical, because that made him feel much more risk averse. When what you really wanted is you wanted him to sign off on millions of dollars of investment on a technology strategy that would pinpoint where the water needed to be delivered. So you had to understand where he was going to be in that certain time. So you've assessed the situation, you've understood your audience. How are you going to start crafting the story? Think about this. A tool that I've always found helpful is being able to, it's overused, the term is workshop the data. But you know what? In an era of where we need to be transparent, we need to be open and embrace the anomalies, the process of bringing people in, engage the people you work with, engage your clients. Say to them, look, I want to invite you to help me understand what the insight is here. Because you're going to have certain surprises. You're going to confirm things that Scott talked about. Some will be hard to explain. But have people work with you through the data to understand what I wish. What did I wish I knew? What is the aha? What is the surprise? Yes, the question you always get, what surprised you in the data? Okay. It also helps if you work through those surprises with the people who are going to use it. Who knew or what? I mean, these are just examples. But when you do that, you start finding themes. I used to have my CMO and marketing teams. We were working on consumer segmentation. And I brought, I brought them into a small conference room, fed them, always good to feed people. And I said, look, here's the data. Here's what we're seeing. Help me work through what you see in this data. Because I had learned from a prior segmentation I had done 3 or 4 years before that, I tried to push it in and drive it through the organization. Everybody said, no, I don't get it. It's because they hadn't been brought into the process. We developed these themes. And then we storyboarded. Look, storyboarding is a classic, it's a classic movie theme and advertising, but it really does help. It really does help because you're going to have these themes and you're going to understand them, but your audience, not everybody in your audience, again, they don't all process information the same way. They haven't gone through the journey of uncovering the data and the insight in the data that you have. So help them storyboard your presentation. Think about a headline per slide. Support it with visuals, not always with data. You've got to find the right balance. Again, this comes back to understanding your audience, and Helen and Tobias will give us some great examples in a minute of how to leverage that. Step back then. Flip through it. One of the things, one of the processes we do here, for example, when we're preparing a presentation for our board, it's generally put together by different departments. Each department contributes their section, and then what we'll do is we'll print out a hard copy, and we have a conference room in the back here. We lay the hard copy, we put it all on the table. And we all walk in and say, okay, does this tell the story we want to tell our board? And you go through that process of stepping back, because it's not just a slide, a slide, a slide. All the slides, like the pages of a novel, have to tell the story. Otherwise, why is it there? So let me give you some examples. Again, sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. I was working on a presentation. Last year about mobile research, and I had a lot of information. Excuse me. And I was trying to make the point of this: the people who were most likely to be taking a survey on a mobile device were millennial and multicultural. So I said, look, I got some bar charts. Bar charts, yay, good, right? Bar charts. You kind of tell the story. You can kind of get the visual. I headlined it. Mobile respondents were likely to be younger and multicultural. I thought, this is making it. I presented it in a workshop, and people said, yeah, no, I don't get it. I don't get it. It's too busy. Too much. Too much. All right, I tried again. I said, well, here, what if I do this? I've got too many thoughts going on. What if I break the thoughts down? I said, what if I do 2 separate charts? The millennial generation is mobile, okay, so that makes bar charts. I said multicultural generation is mobile, bar charts, okay? Yeah, makes sense. What I lacked there, I lacked attention. I missed the story now. I was focused so much on slides that I lost my message. So I said, all right, scrap this, and I try one more time. How's that work for you? It took a while, but I finally got to the point. I said, look, people my audience understood that millennials and multicultural demographics are growing. And that's where we're going to source business growth. So I could say growth generations instead of millennial and multicultural. It was a mouthful. Mobile, that's what I wanted to talk about. That was the key insight there. And rather than going through all of this, I have it. I said, let me just focus on a couple of key bits. Millennial, multicultural, 49% of mobile survey respondents, millennial, 34% multicultural. Got the message across. It took me a while to get there. But, you know, that's why you go through this process. I'll give you another one. So I had to do a setup. When we talk about, and here at the ARF, we talk about a C-suite question. Are my marketing dollars driving growth? And what I was focused on was trying to talk about mobile research quality and talking about the quality of the data that we were using, that we had to make those growth decisions, to understand if our marketing was effective. So I was building on the thought of saying this one question below the C-suite ask is, can I trust the data to make the right decision? Okay, I framed it. It's a compelling question, I thought, and I workshop when I shared this, and I got the head nods in my audience, and I was like, yeah, that wasn't the reaction I was hoping for. I was hoping to really grab people. So I stepped back. I said, is there another way that I can try to get this point across that we have to focus on the quality of our data? So I said it differently. I said, all right, let me reframe this. If the data is bad, question, okay? If the data is bad, build on me. There it is. Your decisions will tumble like a house of cards. I get the same idea. But now I've done something. Now I've used a visual reference that my audience understood. So I'm talking to a bunch of advertisers and folks in media. They're going to understand Frank. They're going to understand house of cards. Again, even when you're not trying to talk about your data and tell a story from your data, think about your situation, think about your audience, and think about what you have at your disposal in order to engage them in the story you're going to tell. So we're going to practice this a bit more later, but for now what I'd like to do is this. I'm going to invite Helen Doherty and Tobias Stewart from Graphic Digital Agency to the stage. And your pictures didn't get in this one. But we have it in person, it's even better. So a little bit about Helen and Tobias. So Helen and Tobias are joining us from London today. They're with Graphic Digital Agency, which is a Kantar company. And thanks to our friends at Kantar for helping out. A little bit about each of them, so their story. So Helen is a senior producer at Graphic. She's worked in digital media for about the past 6 years. Worked in a couple of agencies, very client-less. She's really led user experience, narrative development, and project management across web development, design, data visualization, and animation for a number of clients. And I think part of her responsibility is keeping Tobias out of trouble. But it's not written down.
Telling me what I'm supposed to be doing.
That's exactly it. So Tobias is head of creative at he was head of creative at Guardian's digital agency. They were the folks that we.
So I must see the Guardian logo.
The Guardian logo, yes, and it's now creative director of Graphic. And he's been working in digital storytelling for about 2 decades now. From web to TV to games and infographics. So we're really excited. I know you've got some great examples. So I'm going to turn over the floor to Helen and Tobias. So thank you very much for being here.
So yes, just in case my bizarre surname wanted spelling out. So yes, we're from an agency called Graphic. We are an agency that specializes in data visualization and information design. And what we're going to be talking about this morning is stuff that we have learned from doing that, and the sort of practices and habits that we find ourselves falling into. Useful habits, thank God, most of the time. What we'll do is sort of, I'll do a quick introduction, and I'll hand over to Helen to actually do the difficult bit, because she's the responsible, intelligent person. And then I will do some hand waving about pretty pictures but to talk about the process that we go through. But first, I want to talk about a news story that hit the UK headlines a couple of months ago. Big international story. The president of Iceland came out with a major statement about an issue which I think affects, I would say, pretty much anyone in the developed world, probably anyone in the world. It is a vexed problem that has troubled millions. And it is the question of pineapple on pizza, and whether it is ever acceptable. And the president of Iceland said it is not acceptable. He was going to ban it. And the British press went wild because, you know, there was no other news going on in Britain. And YouGov, who are really good at this stuff, really great research company, and really savvy in terms of news and public profile, did a really quick survey of the British public, asking them, what do you think of pineapple on pizza? And if you don't like it, what would you prefer? And then they tweeted out this tweet with the results of their survey. And I looked at this, and I had immediately a couple of problems. The second one was, so wait, what do they prefer? Like, what do they think of pineapple? It's really hard to pick out what these numbers are telling us, to find actually that mushrooms are the most popular. If we didn't have the headline, you wouldn't see that bit of information. So immediately, yeah, it's kind of difficult to understand why we're looking at this information, what it's supposed to be telling us. But of course, the first thing that I thought was the thing that you all thought and that Twitter thought, which is, what the hell kind of pie chart is that? What does that mean? Why are all the segments the same size? Why is each segment have 8 different labels? What the hell are you trying to show us? To the extent that YouGov has to follow that up with this tweet. And this is the thing that really struck me. Because this is the first time I've ever seen anyone apologizing for not using a chart. Right? Apologizing for charts all the time. I'm really sorry, it's not right bar chart. But this is an apology for not using a chart. And more important, it's an apology for making something that looked like a chart that people misunderstood. And this was a big thing to me. So one of the other things I do is I still do some work for The Guardian. I teach public masterclasses in data visualization. And when we started out doing it, it was just full of splendid research. But gradually, the audiences got more and more varied. People got more and more knowledgeable about visualization, about chart types, about how they work, how to communicate numbers. And I began to realize that actually people, in the explosion of data visualization over the last few years, have begun to understand how charts work, begin to expect good, solid, comprehensible charting. And this is obviously important for us because that is what we do. We are a data visualization agency. So, as Chris said, we used to be part of the Guardian newspaper. We were a commercial part of the Guardian. We did, so the Guardian, you know, I would say this, but it's fantastic at telling stories, communicating. They've got a really long record for data visualization. There's a chart on the very 3rd edition in 1897. There's a bar chart on the cover. They have been doing this a while. What they're not so good at is making money. They lose something like $1 million a week. It's extraordinary. So we were a commercial arm of the Guardian, making those skills and knowledge in visualization and storytelling available as a commercial service to paying clients. And then one of those clients decided they liked the service so much they bought the company, and we got bought by Cancer. But I stress that commercial aspect of what we do because it has important implications for how we think and how we approach data visualization. Because it means that we're not always doing the same thing and thinking about the same data. We can be telling a story as simple as how people with kids hide from them in the laboratory in order to get their work done. This was a tweet for Charming. The other end of the scale, we're telling really insanely complex stories. This is access and achievement for children from deprived backgrounds in every school, in every part of England. So it's a whole country's educational record in a single chart. And this is a piece of work that we did for the government. This is a big poster to go up for civil servants and head teachers to refer to. Really complex piece of storytelling. And we're talking to different audiences. Sometimes we're talking to really knowledgeable audiences. This was a piece we did for experts in corporate carbon disclosure. So people who really know the data and have a really intense relationship with it. These are people who know that Shell has a huge carbon footprint. You know, they are not surprised by this. I can probably quote more accurate numbers. What they were interested in was data quality. The fact that for some people, we can't quite trust the numbers that they're releasing about their carbon footprints. So that this became a visualization, a kind of meta visualization. Visualization about the quality of the data itself and how some of it is really quite fuzzy. At the other end of the scale, you're talking to an audience who don't yet know that they should be interested in this thing. You're trying to grab the public's attention. This is a tweet we did for Crest. And you're just trying to tell someone something surprising to make them think about how they should be brushing their teeth more and spending less time on Facebook. It didn't strike me doing this campaign that Zuckerberg is, like terrible German suggests, Zuckerberg means Sugar Mountain. And this is quite possibly some kind of conspiracy against oral power. And we're using different media as well. So this is a piece we did actually for our World Panel. This is their brand ranking. And this is a really complex data set, lots of different ways to cut it, lots of different territories, lots of different brands, different ways that you're going to want to analyze this data set. It's dynamic, it's changing constantly. So we have to build something that can be easily updated, that the audience can take charge of, and use all these controls to find the story that they want to find in it. And that means we have to come up with a chart type that's going to adapt to that story and make it evident no matter what that audience is doing to the data. At the other extreme, you're doing something like animation, which, you know, goes past at a set rate, 30 frames a second. You've got 90 seconds. You've got to tell that story in a straight line, no deviation, no interaction. You've got to be really straightforward about it. So these all feel like really different practices. They feel like different things. But what we began to realize in project after project was that essentially we were doing the same thing. That no matter who the client, what the data set, who the audience was, we were essentially doing the same practice. Looking at the data, finding the insight, structuring that, figuring out how to communicate it visually. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about that fundamental process that we apply to almost every project we do. And as I said, Helen's doing this bit because she's the clever one.
So we start with every data visualization in the same way, and we use this process every time. So we have data, story, chart, and design. And it always works in that order, so we always go from left to right. If we try and think of the design and want everything else to work that, bad things happen and it can go wrong. So first we start with the data. And the first thing you want to understand, this just comes from what Scott said, is about accuracy and is it credible. Once you work that out, it's all about finding the stories in that.
And it's all about finding the stories within that. So you might get a spreadsheet, it's got hundreds of data points in there. You might need to chart at this point, but that's for analysis only, and that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about visualization for communication. So you find the stories within that data, work out what the trends are, and when you can see any patterns. Then we move on to the story. And probably we think is the critical point. So this is the point where people like myself who are producers with the agency would sit down with all of the patterns that we found and the stories, the patterns and the trends, and work out what those stories are. Pick out the key points. Sort of 6 or 7 is usually about the right amount for an audience. And then we work out how that's structured. And we structure that with pen and paper or a Word document with lots of text boxes. At this point, it's not about what it's going to look like. It's not about what Chelsea's going to use. It's the order that you want to tell this story and how you structure it. Then we move on to the charting. Now, the charts can help tell those stories. And we use this icon here because this could actually be the same data set. So the line chart would show change over time, but the bar chart would show distinct variables and how they're different. And when you're choosing that chart type, you can influence what the audience takes away from that. So what you want to do with the charts is be clear and functional. And then you work on how they look. So the design is the last point of this. And we're talking about design in like the conventional sense, so what everything looks like, what fonts you're going to use, what colors, if there's any further visuals that assist the charts in there. So all of data visualization is a design principle. So all of these points fit under there, but we're talking about what this looks like. And when you add data, when you add design to the story, that's when you get the magic combination. So when we worked at The Guardian, what we learned quite quickly was if you had a good design, people would get it. They would grab attention. People would start looking at things. If you didn't have the story that backed that up, people started to get annoyed. You started to see comments below the line about how this wasn't quite right or how the data didn't back up the story that you're trying to tell. But what you do when you mix the design and the story is you get good results and you get engagement. So that's what we look for, is that perfect combination of story and design. Now, we don't have any particular principles when we follow data visualization. It's all influenced by our audience. And there are lots of philosophies around, but these two guys here, Edward Tufte and David McCandless, they sit at opposite ends of the spectrum. So Tufte is all about the evidence. It's all about the data, and you make as much data available as possible. McCandless, on the other hand, is about information, picking out those key points and ordering it in a way that will appeal to the audience. Now, why do they do this differently? Well, Tufte comes from an academic background. He's a theorist. He actually teaches this, so he needs to mark students on what they're doing. He needs to be able to say what's right and wrong. And often he's talking to audiences who are already aware of this information. So you might be talking to researchers or academics already in that field who have an understanding of what they're being told. So, for instance, pie charts. Tufte would always say, don't use pie charts. They're evil, they're not going to get your story across, and if you're going to use them in your coursework, 0 out of 10. McCandless, on the other hand, he would use pie charts. They don't necessarily take on or convey the right story or give the information. Those tapering wedges as you go around can be difficult to read. But what he knows is that audiences love circles. People love circles. It's the sun, the earth, the shape of our faces. That's what people like. And that's why we use them here. It's not just that they're bright and yellow. It's the fact that those shapes, they center our attention in there. So there's two different ways to look at this, and from Tufte's side and McCandless's. But the crucial difference here is that Tufte would say, never cheat the data. And this is what Chris and Scott have pointed at as well, point out the anomalies and don't leave anything out. McCandless, on the other hand, would say, tweak the visuals if it makes the story clearer. And now probably quite a few of you are on the Tufte side with this at the moment and thinking, surely it's about the data. Now, if we look at a chart like this, this is one of McCandless's charts, and it's one of his signature charts, the billion-dollar-ogram. So the media are coming out with lots of stories. They're always coming out with stories about this costs X million dollars, X billion dollars. What does that mean? When is it a lot? Should we be worried? You can see right in the left-hand corner here, this is the US defense budget. This is China's and the UK's. You then see that Bill Gates' net worth versus the cost to save the Amazon. Iraq and Afghanistan wars, what they were predicted to cost and what they actually cost. And then, when you scroll down, you get the punchline, the global financial crisis. Now, the thing with this chart, it was featured on The Guardian. It was really popular on the day that it was featured on the Guardian data blog. A lot of statisticians came back and said, how does that work? How does everything line up? How do you get those boxes to neatly sit next to each other and within each other? And what McCandless says, right down here, numbers rounded, slight visual cheating to make things fit. Is it right? In certain circumstances, yes. Who is presenting this data to the Bank of America? Probably not. They're going to want it in bar charts so you can see from beginning to end what that means compared to each other. But to get a story like this across to an audience, to someone like The Guardian, who is talking to the general public, often an interested public already, but the general public who might not understand this total concept, then this was the right choice, and it gained attention for all the right reasons. Now this is a Tufte chart, and you can see that it's very different. It's still designed, it's still beautiful, but for very different reasons. Now what Tufte's done here is remove everything else from the chart. Axes, they're not there. You know, we're talking about countries, we might expect to see flags, no, not even any colours. And what he does here is he uses a ratio of 1:1, so ink to data ratio. You know, every drop of ink should have a connection to the data. So with this chart, the story is clear. Everyone's GDP is going up between 1970 and 1979, apart from Britain, which went down. But it wasn't the only country that went down. Portugal was in there, Brazil, and there are thousands of pieces of data for this. So Tufte has done a bit of cheating, but not changed the data as such, or the way that we present this. There is one slight difference. Belgium and Canada are both at 35.2, but Belgium's slightly higher. Now it does go slightly higher than Canada here as well, but it's raised above because if we put Belgium and Canada next to each other, we change the narrative structure. The read order would be different. Belgium would stick out, and we start to think about, why is Belgium there? Why are Belgium and Canada sat together? Where are the other countries that sit together? So, yes, there is a bit of visual tweaking, but what Tufte does is let the data tell that. And that's because of an informed audience. And that is the main difference between these two guys. So Tufte is talking to researchers, and he's talking to academics. McCandless, on the other hand, he works commercially. You know, he sells these to media outlets. He works as an agency like we do, so he will sell to outside clients. And his vision is to tell stories to people who might not be as informed. So he is loved by journalists and graphic designers, and Tufte by academics and statisticians. So it's all about audience, and that's how we look at ours every single time. So that process of data, story, chart, design is always led by the audience. Now I'm going to show you some examples of some really good storytelling, or what we think is really good storytelling. And all of these examples fit into that area of kind of presenting to an audience who aren't as informed. But each of these you can take as many levels from as you wish. So this is another McCandless chart. You can see that we can take away an initial story of rising sea levels and how it affects different cities. Now he's picked sort of 14 cities. If you look a bit closer, actually we've got New York and Lower Manhattan. We've got London and South London. Sat within this group of cities. Again, this was for The Guardian. So he knows where the Guardian readers are. He knows what countries and cities they might be interested in or know about, but also those two telling points of splitting the cities. You know, Lower Manhattan fits within New York and South London within London, but it's telling that story to the audience and breaking it apart to give different levels. Once you take away that centre bit, you can look at how much the sea level is rising, over how many years, what will the world look like in 80 or 800 or 8,000 years. And then you can look at what the contributors are. So what's already happened, the Greenland ice sheet melting, the Antarctic ice sheet, and where those fit in with the story. So this story is about building those levels. So you grab the attention with the design, but you build on that, and you keep people interested. And what you do with that, especially with publications, is you increase dwell time. Dwell time, it's a signifier of engagement, and ultimately you'll gain advertising, and you can kind of measure this as well. The design will get page views. Something like this, where you're telling a lot of stories, will get you that dwell time. So this is the true size of Africa. This is a designer called Kai Krauser. And he wanted to look at this idea that we're always told that Africa is massive, but how big actually is it? So what he's done here is put all of the countries that he can fit in Africa in Africa. So you've got the whole of Europe, Eastern Europe here, China's split a bit just to fit in with that outline. And you can see there's even gaps in there. What he does with this is you can take that center visual, that's where all the color is, that's where all the initial story is, but then there's the context around it. So down here, he gives them a bit of an explanation into what he calls immapancy, which is illiteracy with maps, and why he thinks this is an issue. Why don't we understand that Africa is this big? Then we've got a table over in the left-hand corner that shows you that with all of these added up, there's still a difference of, I think it's 19. So 19 square kilometers difference. Africa is still that much bigger than all of these countries added up. And then if we want to look at it, the top 100 countries by size. So we list all of those. For those who are interested, Finland is bigger than Vietnam. And we also have, you can see the individual countries within Africa and how those fit if you look at them solidly as a whole. So if we put all of China together, all of Europe together, we can see what that does. So again, there's those levels of storytelling. So you grab attention with that initial visual. You can take that away and you can understand that. Great, you've learned something new. But there's all of this information and context that backs that up as well. Finally, this is a piece for the New York Times. And this is New York weather in 2003. And this shows how you can do so many stories on a single chart as well. Again, you can take away that initial story of the weather. That purple line in the middle shows the variation in weather across the year. Behind that, there's a small brown line that shows the normal rate. And we can see that very rarely does it actually sit within that normal bar. There's a few points in August, but beyond that, it's above and below. Then there's this further kind of beige color behind. This shows record highs and lows over time. So you can see there's a record high in November and a record low in March. Great, you've built up more of that story. Then below we see rainfall and snowfall, so precipitation across the year. We've got some records here in October, we've got record rainfall, we've got record rainfall in June, record snowfall in February. So we start to build this bigger picture of not just the weather in one year, which you can take away from this chart, but this idea of global warming and how weather is affected over the year, over time, and how things can change. So what you get from this chart is that building of layers and levels of story. And with the past three charts that we've shown and the stories that they've told, we get that beginning, a middle, and an end that we seek from any sort of journalistic piece or a novel. And you get to take that away as a full story of something learned. But you get to involve yourself in it, find out those stories for yourself. And that's where this great storytelling comes in. And design then helps that, bring that to life. So here there's been specific design choices that allow you to take those levels of story. And now I'm going to pass you over to Tobias, who's going to go on to the design side.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, design. I want to return very briefly to this pizza, not solely because I am obsessed with pizza, although cheese, tomato, and bread, but what else do you need? Those are the food groups. Because the thing that really struck me about this is that you guys were very well intentioned. They were doing the right thing. Because, let's be honest, numbers are boring. More importantly, numbers are threatening. We are, by instinct, as human beings, lazy. And we are evolutionarily lazy. We have become lazy as a self-preservation mechanism. You know, we rely entirely on instinctive reactions to pick up a cup of coffee, open a door, cross the street. If we stopped and thought about those actions in depth every single time, we would be run over in seconds. That's what Daniel Kahneman calls system 2 thinking, in his Thinking Fast and Slow. The system 1 thinking, sorry, that laziness is completely instinctive and a good thing. It's an evolutionary advantage. The problem is that it means that we resist the system 2 thinking, the difficult engagement with complex information, because we look for instinctive ways around. And so YouGuard's instinct is fantastic. Put in a visual, put in a picture about pizza. What better way to catch people's attention and to make them look? But having caught our attention, having done that job of giving us that hook that Scott was talking about this morning, and as Helen was just saying, attracting our attention, they then fail to deliver on that because this becomes a confusing visual. It doesn't help us navigate that data, and that's really what I want to concentrate on in charting, is that navigation. So sticking on the subject of food, here's a good chart. This is by a guy called Nathan Yao. This is about the subject of food deserts. So what we have here is a map of the contiguous continental states. And across that map, I mean, he's outlined the individual states, and then he's drawn a grid of dots. And from each dot, he's drawn a series of lines to the closest grocery stores. Right? So this becomes a chart of how far people have to travel to get fresh food, not pre-prepared or fast food, but fresh ingredients with which to cook. Because these food deserts. Now, William Cleveland, one of the great theorists about data visualization, said that people look for two things in a chart. What he said was pattern perception and table lookup, because he's an academic and can't help himself. What he meant was overview and detail. And this is precisely what Nathan Yao is doing here. We get that immediate overview. We can see all these blank white areas down the eastern part where people don't have to travel very far, and suddenly these big explosions of red where people have to travel huge distances to get through. So we need to get a sense of the overall pattern and shape of the data. And that enables us to start then looking at the detail, because the two are part of a process. It's interesting that Nathan Yao has used a map here, because this is how maps work. Maps give us an overview of the geography that enables us to explore that geography in one-to-one detail by walking around it. And that's precisely how charts work. This gives us the overview that allows us to focus in on individual dots and begin to examine the detail of the data. And we can, because Nathan Yao has used these little lines to represent his data points. And this is very telling because this is the most accurate form of data representation in shape. So William Cleveland went on to do a series of experiments in which he showed people a set of unlabeled charts. So he just took all the labels up and asked them to guess the data that was represented by the chart. That enabled him to draw up this scale of the accuracy of charts. This is the Cleveland-McGill scale. And what William Cleveland discovered was with what he called length against the common scale. Our old friend, our chart, common chart. People can guess with incredible accuracy. These are really good charts. In fact, subsequent research has begun to suggest that that's a judgment of value that happens in short-term visual memory almost instantaneously, before you've even started thinking about what it is that you are looking at. This chart has snuck numbers into your brain before you're aware of it. This is why we visualize data, to get over that barrier to the system to thinking. Get people thinking about the numbers before they think about it. So this, as I say, scale decreases in accuracy. So we've got things like length and angle, which is a line chart, angle and area, which is a pie chart. So that's one of the reasons why the Tuffy hates them. They're not as accurate as lovely lines and rectilinear shapes. And we get, I mean, I haven't even bothered to try and do an example of representing data by color because it's wrong and bad. It just doesn't work. There's no way your brain can handle this thing is 5 times more red than that thing is blue. It's just not how our perception works. So Nathan Yao has done a very canny thing of representing his data in length. But of course, that's not really the reason why he's chosen length. He's chosen length because his data is about length. It's about length of journey. It's about distance. He's chosen a metaphor that embodies, a visual metaphor that embodies his data. And this is really important because as Helen was saying earlier, the representation of data doesn't just help us understand the numbers, it changes the way we think about those numbers. So this is 2 charts from an experiment by Barbara Tversky and Jeff Zak. They showed 2 different audiences, 2 different charts of the same data. This was about the average heights of 10-year-olds and 5-year-olds. So one audience got shown common chart, the other audience got shown line chart. And then they ask those audiences what they could tell them about the data they just looked at. And what was interesting is that the two different audiences told two completely different stories. The audience that saw the column chart said, well, 12-year-olds are taller than 10-year-olds. The audience that saw the line chart said, children get taller as they get older. Two completely different stories. And the thing is, both are true. Both are present in the data. But the way the data was represented framed the way that people thought about it, changed the way that people approached the data. And this is really important because, yes, we need to be thinking about the accuracy of data representation, but we also need to be thinking about the story that is in that data and how we communicate that. So I have put together, there's a bunch of slides here. I'll race through them very quickly, but there are handouts that I think you have printed out, which we'll share with you, of our choices. Again, this is sort of ranked by, I'm going to stand in front of the radar chart in case anybody gets the idea that it's permissible to use one. I keep wanting to change this for polar area and all that. So we're going in this order. Change over time is almost always a line chart. Change in time over two data points. What I do have, so I don't have with me, but I can share with you, is that, because I realise many of you will have to use PowerPoint. I have done a version of these slides in PowerPoint with PowerPoint charts. So you can make things in PowerPoint. It's not easy. You have to use gradient fills on bubble charts, but it's possible. You can do it. Comparison, almost always column charts, bar charts. That's where it's linear shapes immediately say comparison. I mean, we love polar area charts. They are extraordinarily effective. We've done some research ourselves into how people read charts and effective charts, and with polar area charts, we discovered that they don't just help people remember data in that chart, they remember data in other charts around the polar area chart. It has a sort of magical halo effect. This is, I mean, it's quite right. This is a chart that changed the world. This was invented by Florence Nightingale in her report to Parliament about death and disease in the Crimean War that changed modern hygiene. This report to Parliament. So this is, yeah, thanks to this chart, I survived a cesarean birth. You know, I would not be here if it wasn't for polar area chart. I am quite affectionate towards it. We then have composition, and this is where prize, and again, our research is showing people are really good. If you have two values, like a single percentage, and the remainder, I should always be up 100%. People can read them really quickly because they read them like a clock face. You know, we're used to reading circular shapes by degrees, and so a single value can be very quickly communicated with a pie chart. And then slightly more complex. We'll share a slide at the end with some tools for making charts as well, which may be useful to you. I do want to just say, please stop using flags. No one understands them. I want to know what the flag is smiling at looks like. But also, quite often we find that geography column charts and more conventional charts are much more powerful ways of telling the story than trying to, particularly, I mean, in Europe, we have this problem where we have all these inconveniently shaped and sized countries. You have these tiny little places that we're trying to show as important as Russia, and it just doesn't work. The thing I want to concentrate on before I start getting obsessive about charts is how we then tell the story around that chart. Because once we've figured out how we're going to represent the data, we then have to guide our audience through what is often a very complex story, like this one. So this is another piece by David McCann, in this case working with Stephanie Posevec, who's a designer, who's brilliant. And this is about beliefs, tendencies in left and right-wing politics. I'm not going to discuss, at the risk of some kind of massive argument, I'm not going to discuss those tendencies. What I want to think about is how they are communicating this. This is hugely complex. There's a lot going on. One thing, what Stephanie is using fundamentally is the visual storytelling tools of visual contrast and visual consistency. Visual contrast is extremely potent for catching our attention. I was reading a paper last week, where it's associated with a little dose of dopamine. Just a change in your visual field. Your brain gives you a little bit of dopamine, pleasure hormone, just wakes you up, makes you pay attention. It's an amazing way of getting people's attention. What we have to think about, though, and this goes back to what Scott was saying about that, what was the phrase he used? I really liked it. It was the hook and the structure. You know, that contrast gives us that visual hook to catch our attention. But we then need that structure because we're trying to tell people really complex things. We need that consistency. And Steph is using, I mean, right in that blue and red, that clear color differentiation. So this is, if this was just in black and white, it'd be a really confusing layout. But just in using those clear colors, yes, they have those cultural meanings, so political tendencies, but they also tell us very clearly as readers, this is in two halves. And the use of shading tells us those two halves are reflected. So already, it's made easier for us. There's only one story, there's just two versions of it. Then she's making it less threatening and easier to navigate. And then, in the shapes she's using, so these are the fundamental shapes in those blocks of content. And you can see they are reflected, but they're also alternating. So the read order is in this. You have little arrows, and they go rectilinear shape, circular shape, rectilinear shape, circular shape, rectilinear shape, circular shape. She's got this alternating pattern of contrast, the consistency of contrast all the way through, that guides us, which helps us understand where to go next, that contrasts the bits of content against each other so we can see where one finishes and one picks up again. So already she's atomizing that content, breaking it down so we can see how it is structured, see that story structure within the content. And this goes on all the way down. So in the font, we've got these big titles and these scrolls and then these blocks of color with white text in them. And again, very different. They're contrasted to each other. These are the titles, these are the summaries. But she's using that contrast with consistency to, again, guide us through that story so that we can begin to navigate this complex information and understand how it is structured. It's very clearly indicated to us, which helps us then navigate our way very quickly through what's actually quite dense information. Just by thinking about the structure of the information and embodying that in the visuals themselves. Thinking very carefully how much change we use, because too much change is overwhelming. And this is the core problem and the core thing we have to face, is how we get those hooks and structures that work together to tell a story. One of my favorite writers about visual storytelling is a guy called Scott McCloud. He talks about the goals of visual storytelling being clarity and persuasion. By persuasion, he doesn't mean persuading people of an argument. He means persuading people to look, persuading people to give you their attention. But then rewarding that with clarity so they can understand what it is that you are saying to them. And if we get both those things right, magical things happen. So this is one of my favorite infographics. This is about something kind of very pointless and silly. This is about cover versions. This is about which bands have been covered most in the history of popular music. It will not surprise you to learn that Green is the Beatles. Everyone covers the Beatles. But I think this is an utterly superb piece of work, because it has that persuasion and clarity in perfect balance. We have, I think this is persuasive, it's immediately visually, it piques our curiosity. We're kind of interested in what this is showing us. It's got these nice fluid lines, it's a nice palette, sits well together, it looks appealing, and actually when we realize it's about music, it has this extra little metaphorical visual where it flows down the page, interweaving, interlinking. It's a musical visualization without being very cliche with notes and staves and musical instruments. But when we examine it in detail, when we come from that overview down into the detail, we discover that the data is represented in these little black bars. Length against the common stack. They've used a lovely, accurate piece of data visualization, but they're built around it this beautiful flow. But what I think is truly brilliant is what they have done with the story. So the tendency if you're looking at the history of popular music decade by decade, would be to go decade by decade, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They haven't done that. They've instead looked at the data. They've seen that there's this big green swath up here, and there's this narrow bit here, then there's this craziness down here. And that, to them, has predicted the visual structure. The visual structure grows out of the data. So that gives them these three clear sections, three acts, you might almost say, set up conflict resolution, in which to display. And the moment you start telling the story like that, it becomes much more about the data itself, and it opens that data up to interpretation. I mean, being the age that I am, what I see is that the baby boomers are all liars. The 60s was not a great period of originality and invention. It's nothing but business colours. And as I always suspected, good music doesn't start till 1977. And all the kids get synthesizers, learn 3-chord, start a punk band. You've got no cover versions at all. It's all really great original music until in 1994, Kurt Cobain goes into a shed, blows his head off, and all hell breaks loose. You've got the TV sort of talent shows, people are covering you too. One version is already too many. Do not need this.
It's an interesting breaking in too at Queen.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really odd.
Yep. Right?
That is, I want to know what that is now. Why do people, when did he die? Well, right?
How he died. And that's probably when it started picking up.
Yeah.
And probably.
It's because they became incredibly unfashionable. Well, that's what I thought by the Queen. Yeah. But isn't this a great piece? Because it takes what's essentially quite a dull, tedious data set about cover versions, the most basic form of music. And I'm being upset. Diva's cover of Can't Get No Satisfaction is one of the great works of popular culture. And it opens it up because of the way they thought about the visual storytelling. It makes it inviting, helps us explore it, and opens it up. It tells us their story, but in doing it, it then empowers us as an audience to find our own stories in that data because we're invited into the story, which is the point of what we are doing. I would just say, we have some slides here. These will get past you of good blogs. So this is Nathan Yao that I was talking about. Some good books. David McCandless's information is beautiful. Edward R. Tufte's The Constitutive Display, the visual display of constitutive information. You can tell a lot about the two men. This book, Nathan Yao's book, brilliant. Get it. It's amazing. Probably most useful for you is not Twitter, because we're not supposed to be looking at that right now. These resources, I would definitely recommend. The Now project is free and Creative Commons iconography. You can just search it. It's a designers, it's a community for designers to upload icons and share them, which is also true of Cooler, which is I think it's now called Cover, because Cover has a U in it, by the way. It's another community. Designers can create palettes and upload them, but also it's got a color tool so that if you have a color you need to work with it, you can think about color relationships and the stories you want to tell with color. Most particularly, I point you to the database catalog, which is brilliant. These guys are going through chart types, writing them up, talking about how they work, but then they have links to tools to make charts. So if you want a capella area chart, you can go there, look it up, and it's got a whole load of links to free tools, a lot of them free, that you can just use to download those. But there are tons of tools and resources. One last thing, which is probably relevant to you right now. We have a Google Doc where we document all these things, all these tools, resources, best practice, all this kind of stuff. A lot of this talk is in there. So if you want to have a look at that now, and we also have a blog, which hasn't been updated in the last couple of days, so I've been here. Terrible. My social media skills are all this bad. But your presentation skills, outstanding. 10 out of 10. So
Tobias, Helen, thank you both very much. Big round of with us live. We're going to take a break, plan about 15 minutes. We're fortunate in that Helen and Tobias are going to stay with us until 12:30, and so you get the advantage of their coaching. So we said the last hour of our lab today is the opportunity for you to actually practice what we've preached. Hopefully you brought either a presentation you're currently working on or one you need to revise or whatever it may be. But it always helps when you can apply what you've learned right away. So we're going to take the last hour. Partner up with someone, either if you came with someone, work together. Always helps to do it in a pair or trio. Practice it. We are here to help advise you. We've got handouts. We've got handouts just to those 5 questions of the situation assessment, as well as Helen's graphics, your chart on data chart graphic design. So you're going to have those available to you. We're going to come back in this room at about 12:15. Folks can stay in this room. We've got a conference room to the front with a table. We've got a conference area to the front here where you can work. It's all about getting an opportunity for you to practice. For those of you who are on our live stream, we're sorry that we can't do this kind of practice with you virtually. We haven't figured that one out yet. But I will offer you this. Anybody who stays with us and wants to share with us your adaptations, you will automatically be graduated as a Master of Storytelling and Influence, and you will receive your certification plaque probably in the first part of June. For those of you who are joining us virtually, the offer is this. Share with us your revised presentations sometime before the end of May. Demonstrate how you've applied the principles. You'll also be recognized as the Master of Storytelling and Influence. For those of you who've been part of our lab before, you may know that we generally have a certification test after our lab classes. Well, it's kind of hard to do a test, a quiz on storytelling, so that's why we're saying, show us what you've done, show us your revisions, you passed the course. So, with that, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back in here at we're going to come back together about 11:15. For those on live stream, we're actually going to kill the live stream now. But thank you for being with us. And if you've got questions, type them in the ARF questions box. Thanks all.